Please join me in giving Doug Nolte a warm Pachyderm Club welcome.
Well, thank you. Normally I don't have to talk into a microphone, but I trust that if I get too loud, you'll tell me to be quiet. It's a joke. Okay. It's good to be here. I was actually thinking back, 2019, July of 2019 was the last time I was privileged to speak to the Pachyderm Club, and good friend John Stevens had invited me, and he was somewhat of a mentor and good friend in my career at the police department, and I involved him in some shenanigans, as probably some of you have as well. So we miss John. Thank you, John Todd, for the nice introduction. When Jennifer Basinger asked me to speak on the topic of homelessness, it came on the heels of a couple of conversations that one I'd had with her, and then some things that were going on locally. And what I'd like to do as I chat with you about what's going on in homelessness is kind of set a stage for a little bit of historical where Wichita has been, where Sedgwick County has been, and where we are now, and then kind of maybe talk a little bit about where do we need to move, where should we be moving, and then obviously I want to give plenty of time for question and answers. So a little bit about homelessness. If you are out today, a lot of our homeless that are in our community will be either in a shelter, under a bridge, and trying to get out of the elements. As it gets colder, they will certainly seek warmth and food and comfort that they can get. And so for the last 5 years, my role as the CEO of the Union Rescue Mission was to provide that. And interesting to watch how trends are. The first thing I just observe about those that are experiencing homelessness is they aren't too much different than you and I. They care about where they live. They care about how they live. They may not have the means to live like you or I may, but they are very involved in the process of how they live. And so it's important that in any of these remarks, I don't want to dismiss someone that's experiencing homelessness, because they are truly, they're human beings first and foremost, but secondarily, if we can help them and they can get on track, they won't be out on today's like today, and they'll change. And I've got a story of a guy that was able to kind of be the composite of what I would say is possible. So Sedgwick County in 2023, January 25th and 26th, the governing bodies, the social service agencies participated in what's called a point-in-time count. Many of you have probably heard of the point-in-time count specific to homelessness. It's a 24-hour period in which anyone and everyone that can identify someone that is experiencing homelessness is counted. And there is no good way to do it other than to get out on the streets, to go to shelters. And so using that as kind of a framework, 702 people last January were identified as being homeless in Sedgwick County. Now, that number is probably low because those are the ones that we would count. You would typically want to count in a time frame where it's cold, because going to the shelters where, again, there are people that are going to stay because of the elements, it's probably the best count we can give, but it is certainly not accurate. And I'm also going to just say that when you look at that number, it's an increase of 12% from 2022. So if you want to know if it's going up, it is. Our experience when I was at the mission over the last year is that we've seen our numbers about 15% up. So they mirror what we're seeing in the point-in-time count, maybe a little bit higher. Now, the real question is, if they're staying in a shelter, they're staying in transitional housing, how many of them are actually living on this street? And the answer to that would be 150 people were in an environment that's not suitable to live in, on the street, under a bridge, in a car. And that's a significant number of people in a community our size to be out on the street. It gets a little bit muddier when you start saying, well, what is homelessness then? Is it someone that is sleeping in a car in a bridge, or if someone is in transitional housing? And this is where I would say the government they try to do a good job, but they get it wrong, is that homelessness is it's a large term that means different things to different agencies. So in other words, does the right hand know what the left hand is doing when they define what homelessness? So in doing some research, I thought this was I'm going to read you something, and it'll kind of give you an insight into why homelessness as a social issue or a health issue or a housing issue becomes very, very complicated very quick. And in fact, if you were to say, ask one of my teenage daughters, well, what happened to your friend from last week? They'd say it's complicated. I would say homelessness is equally as complicated. So let me read you what the National Health Care for the Homelessness Council says. The federal government uses multiple definitions of homelessness according to its different agencies. Wonderful. The Department of Housing and Urban Development, which is principally responsible for programs addressing homelessness through the Continuum of Care program, uses a comparatively narrow, though complex definition of homelessness. Since this is employed for the annual point-in-time count, which I talked about, it's widely used as the official estimate of homelessness in the United States. The HUD definition is arguably the most authoritative. And essentially what the HUD's definition is that if you have been homeless, you are considered homeless if in a period of time, within a year, you've experienced 3 or more events of homelessness, a night where you did not have shelter over your head, or you were in an emergency shelter, or a period of time of several days where you were you would be considered homeless. And you can identify yourself as being homeless as well. So there is, if you look at HUD, and I'm going to pick on HUD for a little bit, because HUD, as the National Healthcare Council says, they're arguably the most definitive and authoritative because they have all the money. And in a minute, I'm going to try to bring all these points together. So the first thing is that the federal government has a stance on what is homelessness. We know that they have money. So a couple of observations. Government sets policy, or they should. The federal government then establishes who is going to oversee that policy. And in this case, Housing and Urban Development is the governing body. There is a pile of money associated with, I say a pile, it's not sitting there in a pile. And if you look at what Housing and Urban Development is trying to do, they are trying to build infrastructure for living in our country. The problem there is that what are they going to do? My observation to you is, or my comment to you is, that if you're interested in housing, you're going to fund those things that go towards housing. So you may have heard of programs called Housing First or Rapid Rehousing. These are programs that identify how do we get someone experiencing homelessness into a stable environment, into a home, into a residence, because that is what HUD wants to see happen in order to get them stabilized. In other words, for dignity, for health, for safety, get them into a house and then figure out what needs to happen to get them in a better situation. There are those that would probably die on the hill to say these are the most important things. On the flip side of it, you would say, well, what is the benefit of putting someone into housing who is unstable and who can't pay rent and who is unable to do these things without more help. And therefore, aren't we just wasting money? And I would say yes and yes. There's room for both, but you have to understand that homelessness isn't a one-size-fits-all. You didn't get there. And so that's the observation there, is that if your housing and urban development is funding towards that, they're providing money to the continuum of care. And by the way, Sedgwick County has Impact ICT. It's administered through the United Way. It is our continuum of care component. And I will tell you that most of the grants that they gave out to providers had to do with some kind of transitional housing or other stable housing first or rapid rehousing. That's what they're geared toward. So when you see policy set, we're seeing policy, the money following the policy, and you're seeing programs that go after that. Now, I'm just going to tell you, I don't, because I'm retired from the police department, the city of Wichita can't get mad at me, or at least they won't, may or may not like what I say. The Union Rescue Mission, who I used to represent, they'll probably agree with me 100%. But as a private citizen, what I would tell you is, if your policy is set to hold the money, I would liken it to the government holds all the cards. They're like the crack dealer that moves into a neighborhood. They've got a lot of crack, they spread it around, everyone gets hooked on the crack, and now we've got a bigger problem. And that's what we're seeing when the federal government holds piles of money, and I say piles again facetiously, that they hand out for certain things. And these groups that go after that money oftentimes will drift from their original mission to facilitate getting that money, and therefore by taking that money they take on additional maybe terms of engagement or agreement of why they would take that money, and they start slowly losing why they began doing what they're doing. And it's called mission drift in many places, and I will tell you it's dangerous because the government then becomes kind of the owner of the problem without taking any of the ownership. They put the money out and then they say, we're giving money. I'm going to make a comment that I would say that is what we see here locally, is that money is being given from the federal government, it's passed through state and local, and it's being implemented. If you were to look at the budget of the city of Wichita or Sedgwick County and look at what they're funding in terms of specific money designated for homelessness issues, you might be surprised that there's very little of it to none. And other than and I'll try to hold my tongue, the city of Wichita giving close to $750,000 to focus at, and I believe probably most of that money was allocated through federal funding anyway that was passed through. It's the first time that the city has actually put up some true money. The other thing I'll say is this, and I want to be real careful that anyone that's providing a service, whether it's Union Rescue Mission, Humankind, Open Door, Salvation Army, Catholic Charities, we are not, what I would say, at odds with each other and how the money is being implemented. And most of us would agree that a money given to any of these organizations helps the other organization, as it should be. If we're all going after the same money to try to accomplish the same things, it's not going to work out real well. And so we need to make sure that we are, I want to set the stage that we're not at odds with one another. So the fact that one organization gets money should be, in fact, helping all of us. The real question is, what's the local policy on homelessness? And this is where it gets a little bit tricky, and I will tell you, in 5 years of being in the homeless social service area, I'm not sure that there's a clear policy that we are following locally for how we want to address. We know that homelessness has blight issues, it has health issues, and it has economic development at stake. We know for a fact that where there is homelessness, there is a potential for a health epidemic. Union Rescue Mission has a building downtown, and if you walked anywhere on the perimeter of that building, you would smell, unfortunately, smells that should only be reserved for a bathroom, because it's nothing because for these homeless to use the facilities wherever they can. They will camp, they will put up tents. And these are not necessarily safe places because there are things that go on in those areas where they're not policed appropriately, drug use as well as assaults, whether they're sexual assaults. So what I would say is it's a true health and safety issue on the street. What's our policy for that? Well, about a year ago, City of Wichita drew white lines and said you can't be on one side or the other. And I say that to just underline that the complication of just putting a line and saying where you can be and where you can't be doesn't solve the problem, it displaces it. And so they move to other areas where they are not going to feel like they are being intruded upon. But policy hasn't been clearly defined so that we can actually rally and get this person help and where the money is. You'll hear things that will be well, let me back up. One of the questions I'm frequently asked is, well, what should we do? And so what I would say is in the social service area, that is what we should be focusing on. If there is an issue, I would advocate that the citizens get behind those that are providing actual on-ground services. But we tend to divert and rely on the government. And last time I was here, I think I told you, one of the biggest things that has been a blessing and a curse is the 911 system. Because when someone calls 911, we send an emergency response. And unfortunately, that emergency response is only there to deal with the immediate, not the long term. And it ties up very valuable resources. And as many of you know, in my police career, I was the commander of the homeless outreach team. And unfortunately, what I would say is that is not necessarily a job that needs to be occupied by a commissioned police officer as much as a team of caregivers. And we're seeing those models populate where you have a group of individuals, including law enforcement, social workers, go out into the community. And that model really it needs to be highlighted. That's money better spent. But when 911's your call, and the police show up, or there's a heavy presence of enforcement, that doesn't always set well. And so you have kind of a negative effect in a community that is already on the margins. And again, knowing that these are people and they are in trouble. So what's the local policy? And I'd encourage you, as you talk to your elected officials, to simply say, what's the city of Wichita, what's Central County, what's the policy that you are driving towards for being a community that addresses homelessness? Probably the thing that I would also say is that what's realistic. So if the policy's out there and the money follows the policy to where it's going, where it needs to go, then we really get down into a level playing field of who can we help. In my own family, I will tell you that I have kids that have mental health issues. And as they get older, those are more complicated. As we try to get help to them, it is more difficult because it's really contingent upon them. We cannot force them, as those experiencing mental health issues or substance abuse issues, or really the fact that they don't have a place to stay other than they want to be on the street, to do anything. And that's a real challenge because if they are not in a position to want to change, we can't, as a community, force that change. Courts have been very protective, as they should be, of individual human freedoms and rights to do as you want within reason. But unfortunately, there's a segment of the population here in Wichita and other places that are just content to be out there. the lifestyle they live is congruent with what they want to do, and they're not going to change that. What I would say is we still need to provide resources, but we also have to recognize that if the door is open and the animal, that's the wrong term, I don't want to use animal. If someone gets out into the system, it's like putting the genie back in the bottle. So forgive my poor use of analogy there, but we're trying to create something that fixes a problem that is more difficult and more complicated. When you introduce mental health issues, substance abuse issues on top of poverty and lack of resources, it's very hard. And you're going to spend a lot more money trying to get an effective change. So it's kind of a bleak picture right now. There's no policy. There's money, but where's it strategy and that policy going? Well, it seems to be housing, and so you'll find out that in a hot housing market, in Wichita right now is a fairly hot housing market, that landlords can in fact charge rents. We see that the rent is not affordable. And so while the city of Wichita has money through HUD to put people in housing, getting the vouchers filled with landlords that are willing to rent is a challenge. And so there becomes this kind of ecological system within the city and county. So the challenge is, if that's happening, we have to address those needs. So I think that the government, the social services, they need to come together. And I will give kudos to Sedgwick County for the Substance Abuse Mental Health Coalition coming together. Although I will say in the meetings that I attended over the last 6 to 7 years, it's hard to bring 200 people into a room and try to get something going where it's cohesive. They've broken down into smaller committees, but again, very general. They're trying to set policy, probably not as quickly as I would have hoped they would have. But there's not a lack of action. It's maybe just an ineffective action. So as I look at that, I want to say that really what I would encourage everyone to begin to look at is what is possible. So if there are people that do not want to come off the street for whatever reason, there are those that do, that they find themselves in a position where they are on the outs, they don't want to be there, and whether or not it's an issue of their doing, such as substance abuse, or maybe they lost their job and they can't make ends meet, and so they've fallen on hard times. How do we help move them forward? And I'd like to tell you a little bit of a story about Don. Don is a man that came to the mission, and I'll tell you, I'm very much in favor of finding things that are proactive in the community. One of the things that we see related to homelessness, especially with men, is incarceration as a past. It is the scarlet letter that follows them around. Some of them are coming out with violent offender tags on them, sexual predator tags on them. And it's very hard to place these people in society. And I don't excuse their previous behavior, but we do have to recognize what is proper and how do we help them. And the mission, as well as several other shelters, are willing to take in these offenders. The challenge is that probably 90%, 85 to 90% of all clients that we would see have some sort of incarceration in their past. So the question then is, how do we effectively, if we know they're coming out of prison or coming out of incarceration, how do we get them into a position where they don't get into homelessness as the next step, or they don't reoffend and go back into prison? And so what I would say is the proactivity is where we need to focus a good balance. We need to reduce the demand, not only address it where it is, but we need to reduce the demand for those that are seeking homeless services. So how do we do this? Well, Don came to the mission. Don's about 50 years old. Don struggled with incarceration. Don's a minority. There's probably some things that happened that created some difficulty to him. But one of the things that I would tell you is that there is a system by which Don got into probably what I would say an administrative ticky-tack situation for the last 20 years in which his fines began to overtake the act, or the penalties and the interest for his original fine began to define what he actually owed. So he owed the state of Kansas a lot of money. It got to be close to $25,000. Don had a prison background. Getting stable employment was tough. He'd be in and out of homelessness if he wasn't incarcerated. He had a drinking problem, and really was kind of what I would say, unfortunately, the most common kind of individual that's experiencing homelessness that we see. Don was very intelligent, and is very intelligent, not was, is. He's an incredible writer. If you hear some of his poetry, it's beautiful. Don is someone that can bake and cook. He would grace us in his time with bringing fresh cookies and pies and different things. So what I would also encourage you and make an observation is that when you see someone that's experiencing homelessness, there's a story behind that person. There's someone's son or daughter. There's someone that has had an interesting life. They're oftentimes very interested and eager to talk about it. But I will also say they're very, very adept and manipulative. So if you were to see someone on the corner that has a sign saying anything helps, that's not the time to engage them about why they got there. But I would also say that in a controlled environment where they are somewhere safe, these are some of the most interesting and wonderful people you could meet. And again, I go back to the dignity of human life. They are people that have fallen into some very bad situations, some of their own accord, some not. So Don, 2 years ago, finds his way to the mission. He has kind of been in and out of missions around, but Don decided that he wanted to make some changes. And John Todd and I were talking before I got up here about what is the solution. If we know that the problem exists and we know that some are going to come in, what is out there? What's possible? And I would say any program that we can offer someone to meet a specific need in their life, whether it's spiritual, emotional, mental, or financial, we need to provide those for those that are going to take advantage of them. And at the mission, we had a program that when I first came here in 2019, we called it New Beginnings. We since changed it to Solid Ground. And Solid Ground is a program, it's about 9 to 12 months, depending on how long it takes a guy to do it. And there is a case leader that is there. We don't charge the man to be there, so for 9 to 12 months, we're giving them a place to stay. We're going to feed them, and we're going to give them case management. Now, I won't say that the case management is telling them exactly what to do, when or where, but there's a rhythm to life here that many of them thrive in. It gives them a schedule. It gives them something that they're going to do. And we address the mental, the emotional, the physical, the financial, the spiritual needs that all these men have. And Don saw that. Now, I will tell you, Don didn't show up to do the program necessarily, but he saw the value in the program. And another observation is if you have something of value and someone can see it, they are more likely to take it than not. So what are we providing as a community that they see as valuable, that they can see and put their own mind to it to say, we want to move on and get out of this. So Don took advantage of Solid Ground. He got into that program. But the interesting thing about Don, as I mentioned, that he had several thousand, probably close to $25,000 worth of penalties and interest stacked on, and he had not paid a dime for 20 years. Now, you'll never hear me advocate for, ignoring your financial responsibility. I have to pay taxes. You have to pay taxes. If I get caught speeding, I've got to take it to court or deal with it. If I'm late on a bill, I've got to make that up. And so our goal of our program was not to fix anything for them or to excuse it, but it was to let them know they have a responsibility. And I would say programs that all over the country that are are truly making a change will tell you they're not letting, it's not a free pass. They're actually saying if you want to be a changed person and change your trajectory, you got to own what is yours. And I'll tell you the biggest curriculum buster, if you want to know what caused people to get out of our curriculum, is a course called self-confrontation. And if you put a big mirror in front of any of us and we were to stare at it and say, well, what do we like, what do we don't like, we'd probably all bounce out, because there's plenty that when I look in the mirror at see Doug Nolte, I'm not real pleased with, or I don't want other people to see. It's the same thing for many of these that are experiencing homelessness, trying to get out of that. Don hung in there, but here was Don's challenge. He had Mount Everest in front of him, because he could not see how he was going to. He spiritually had found his faith again. He actually had gone to got some job vocational skills, and Textron hired him, and he was beginning to make some money. They trained him. And he had a vocation that he could go on. But Don had zero clue how to take money and put it to use in a way that was helpful and productive. And so therefore, when he got to that point where it started to be, I need to take responsibility financially, Don got a little bit worried and wanted to turn to the bottle. That was his first line of defense. And I'll tell you, it was in that process that we had, and very blessed to have, a former bank regulator, commercial lender, as our CFO. And what we began to uncover with Don through meeting with them was, well, how do you set up a budget? But secondarily, we started looking at, well, how did the fine amount get to be the fine amount over 20 years? And Don would go, I don't know, that's just what they told me I owed. And we're telling Don, well, you got to pay it because that's your responsibility, but you need to pay what you owe. And we began to look into some of the particulars. And what I would say is, if you see where I might be going, is that all of a sudden after 20 years, money that is sitting there accumulating doesn't necessarily go to a line item receipt. And we asked for it from the state of Kansas. And there's programs that aggregate all your fines and whatnot. And they had a hard time giving a bank regulator, a former bank regulator, answers that were satisfactory. And so I'll tell you that the system is broken in some ways, because Don actually, to move this along, paid off $22,000 worth of fines through his job at Textron. That was money that would not have gone into the state coffers otherwise. And secondarily, he has gotten his driver's license unsuspended. And I see my friend Walt over here. Walt's been good about working on that. But here's a sense of pride. Don's done something that he hasn't been able to do for 20 plus years, which is live debt-free, not owing someone a dime, especially government. He has a driver's license and he has a job. And what that means is he's actually in the process of moving out into his own place. He's now got the ability to pay taxes, to give to community, and that's what's possible. And what I want to tell you is that we're missing some of what's possible because we're focusing on a lot of things that aren't going to get us there. And it's because our policies are saying, well, if you want money, if you want this to happen, get them into housing. And I would say that I believe that some of what needs to happen is a change of that policy, because guys like Don, it's interesting. When Don got excited about it, guess what Don did? Don went back to a couple of guys that he knows and starts telling them, hey, it's possible. And all of a sudden we have a cottage industry. My CFO, who came to balance our books and do forecasting, has guys walking into his office going, I want to be like Don. How do I get what I need to do to be free of these things? There is a desire. And when we forget that, and we just look at it very isolated, we forget that these are men and women who can make a change. It's different for men and women, and I will tell you that women oftentimes are victims of a closer circumstance of how do they survive. How are they going to make it? If they have a child, how are they going to make it with that child? And if you look at our foster care system, many of them aren't, because these families are going into the foster care system. So when we look at what's possible, I would say we need to look at what's going to change in policy. And I'll say here, it was probably late summer, Senator Marshall's office. In fact, it's one of the reasons why Jennifer Basinger and I were talking as we connected at that session. And he offered a glimpse of hope, what I think from a federal government standpoint is going to be key in changing it. First is that maybe HUD is not the only or the exclusive provider of money to do these things, but also the Department of Health and Human Services becomes a key component policymaker for how they're going to distribute money, so that programs that are looking at the holistic rehabilitation or restoration of someone so they can be re-engaged back into our community as a productive citizen, as a good neighbor, as an employed person. It is possible. And so when we see that the federal government's talking and wanting to shift that, that's an important factor. But I go back to local and saying, what is it going to call it? What are the local policies that are going to reinforce that? And the challenge is there's very little money to go around. I would also encourage you to look at those organizations, whether it's Catholic Charities, Humankind, Union Rescue Mission, Open Door, others that are providing it. What is their dependency on government funding versus raising their own funds? And probably the thing that I would say, what I mentioned about Don is there was a level of accountability. We never told Don, you don't have to pay $25,000 of back fines to be with us. We said we'd walk along with him while he did it, and he did it. He did the work, he got the pay, he paid off the fines. We helped him see a bigger picture, and in fact we believe through what he told us that he was close to just giving it all up and going back to the bottle. It was just easier. But in the same vein, one of the things that has constantly been kind of a negative for social services or anyone that's working with the government is, what is the net result? What are you producing that is justifying the amount of money? And I would say this, and whether it's Union Rescue Mission or anyone else, if you're going to give $750,000 to do something, what can I expect for that money as a tax-paying citizen, as someone that is interested in my community? And we're not asking those questions, and very rarely are we actually seeing something that we can put out there and show as a defined. And it's not going to be, I tell people all the time, in the homeless community, it's not one for one. There's not going to be one person that comes in and one person that leaves. There may be 20 that come in and maybe none leave because of the way this is. So I would say that as a community, we've got our work to do. We need to be proactive. We need to be very vigilant in not just addressing the needs of what we see now, but really being proactive to say what's possible and where do we need to go. So thank you very much, and I'll open it up for questions. Go ahead. Oh.
Yeah, thank you for the testimony. One thing we're lacking is the word vagrancy. You know, we got vagrancy in our criminal code of Wichita, and public defecation, public urination is against the law. It appears it's not enforced. So what percentage of these supposedly homeless are really vagrants? Because the vagrants, we could go ahead and send to San Francisco on a bus. And that's right. Just get them out of here. The people want to help, we want to help, but the vagrants, we don't want to help, we give them money.
Well, it's an interesting point you make, because I would say vagrancy versus homelessness, they are two separate things. And if you think that New York City, the first weekend of November, gave one-way tickets to 5 people to Dwight D. Eisenhower who had no place to go. The airport called us up and said, what do we do? So it's happening, and we can send them somewhere else. They're just going to keep sending them. So displacement happens both ways. St. Louis, there was a big brouhaha that they were using federal ARPA money to give bus tickets or transportation to anywhere in the Midwest besides St. Louis. And supposedly there was a paper money trail. So you're right, we could move them out. That doesn't necessarily mean that we keep everyone out, because now we'll have a more transient population. The real challenge is that I would say when you, and this is something we have to all kind of recognize, the police department's woefully underfunded and understaffed right now. So if it comes down to investigating something of consequence or citing someone for defecating on the sidewalk, that's going to be tough. The courts, the prosecution, they may support it, but it gets bogged down. The second thing is do we put those people into jail? Probably not. And then third is, can they pay a fine? So we're in a situation where we have to recognize that enforcement does not fix any of this. It's a part of it, but we have to provide adequate solutions. So one of the things I would say is, if you want to be vagrant, what is the city of Wichita, Sedgwick County doing to create a safe space to go be vagrant? Right now there's nothing. One of our proposed solutions at the mission was to create an environment where you could camp out legally by city manager. The ordinance right now in the city of Wichita is you cannot camp in any tent or any fashion if there's a shelter bed available to you. But why not create an environment where it is secure, it is someplace where they can be. These are things that have worked in other communities. We need to look at them. But whether or not we create that space or not, 2 blocks over when I drove in, they're still out there camping and they're on tents. So they're doing it anyway. And I'm not a big into, well, if they're doing it, so we just ought to enable it. Enabling it doesn't solve it. It's what is the flow to get them into a safe spot, to get them into a system. So that's not easy to do, and I wouldn't say enforcement's the way.
Hey, how you doing? Okay.
Yeah, my question is along the same line. I wish Jennifer was here. But in the last 4 weeks, Jennifer said that a survey was done here in Wichita, Kansas, to homeless people, and that only 15% wanted to stay here in Wichita. The other 85% wanted to be in some other city, whether it be Lawrence or Topeka or San Francisco or New York. She didn't say, but she said 85% did not want to be here in Wichita.
I don't refute that. There are kids in my house that don't want to be here. So, to be honest with you, if you go to downtown LA, the problem is astronomically higher in the warmer climate states, San Antonio, Texas, Florida. And comparatively, what I would say is, if you look at national statistics on homelessness, Kansas ranks very, very low in terms of problem. Our per capita homelessness is like eight people per 10,000. So when you look at it, part of what we're talking about isn't a huge problem, but it is a noticeable problem here. The question is, are we going out to those? For instance, you go survey someone, they say, well, I really don't want to be here, I want to be there. Okay, well, not to dump our problem on someone else, but is it realistic to get them there? I have no problem with helping someone along, but we got to remember too that there are cities and municipalities that are offering, we'll get you out of here. The other challenge is, and I don't know how much I believe this, but I think there is some truth to it, but how strongly it happens is that, again, if you provide a service worthwhile, like City of Wichita, Sedgwick County, there's a lot of services here. If you don't want to be on the street and you want a good meal, I can get you whatever you need here, to include clothing and probably fairly short place to stay. If that's what you're interested in doing, then I can get that. And so those that are interested in what's the next city up to go, there's a little circuit that they'll make around. And they may not be in Wichita for a couple of years, but they're going to come back because they've worn out their welcome, or there's no more resources there. And so it's a transient population. In the back.
What about family? Do you ask them do they have any family that would accept them around drugs? Of course, that's probably normal. But.
Absolutely. One of the first things we talk to them about is, for the guys that we work with, but I think universally, is there a support system somewhere? The police department, when we were there, was very active in finding home or family in other areas that could and would take them. And you will be surprised at probably wouldn't be surprised. Family is very keenly interested and wants to help. They don't want to have to bear it on their own. And as a community, we need to make sure that we help them where we can. But we reunified several on the police department. Likewise, what I would say is when you're talking about a program that seeks to look at self-confrontation, no one lives in a vacuum. When I leave here today, I'm going to go home, and if I didn't leave things well with my wife, I got to go home and deal with that. And many of our men have just real blatantly messed up a lot of their mistakes. And what's really neat and fun to see is when they can come back and they can repair those relationships. We have 4 guys in the last year that have reunited with their families because families said you couldn't come home, and they saw enough change that they said, please come home. So it's possible.
Very good. I'm a housing provider. In fact, I've been doing it for 50 years.
Good for you.
And
Thank you.
I work with the low-income population of Wichita. I've helped people have home when other people wouldn't take them in because they had a felony on their record or a past conviction or something like that. But now, don't laugh when I give you this suggestion. The closest model in our community to being what people need to get them off the street and into a structured environment and get their minds straightened out, from my experience, would be what I see work release is. The building right across the street from the new Interest Arena downtown. Because they've got a roof over their head, they've got rules that they have to be in by a certain time, they line them up with work, productive work, they sequester their income, everything that our free society gives people the right to screw up. They screw up their house, they invite 22 people, homeless people, to come over and use their bathroom, to take showers and things like that. What would you think about a work release, heavy duty structure to get these people out of the gutter, get their mind right, and then see them graduate and move into their own house?
Well, I think that's a great idea, and I don't think it's crazy, and that's what we do at the Mission in our Solid Ground program. Your challenge is if they aren't coming out in any sort of on paper or otherwise, you got to be real careful because they can walk out at any time. So you got to make the environment right for them to stay. So work release has one advantage over everything that say our shelter doesn't. They're going back to prison if they don't. Now that being said, one of the interesting initiatives that we've taken on with Kansas Department of Corrections is that most of the men that are coming out of incarceration, and I speak to men because that's what we talk to them about, they're willing and want some support. And so KDOC has money, and we have engaged in ongoing conversations where if they're on paper, if they're on parole or on probation, that we do act in that environment. And again, there's research that it's exactly what you said. Work is a part of this. But I probably didn't say that. Part of what our program is, you got to get a job. We don't let you sit around and do nothing. That's not part of the equation of what we're wanting to do. So while I would say I didn't say that, it's very much work becomes central. Now finding a place, be real honest with you, when you got a sex offender who has very limited where they can be and who they can be around, it presents a challenge. But we do have employers in the city of Wichita that do that. So I don't think you're crazy. I think you're right on, and advocate for those agencies that are doing that.
Hi, my name is Keenan. So hey, I wanted to know, are you a part of any task force that's looking to keep the Sedgwick County Police Department, the Sedgwick County Police, or or any of these agencies, and hold them accountable for actually how they deal with the homeless?
Are you asking me personally, or?
As an organization or a business, or yourself?
Well, no, we are not affiliated with any kind of regulating of law enforcement. And what I would say is we're at the whim when they come to our facility of, the way anyone else are. So I'm not sure I understand the question, but no, there's no direct link to anything we're doing to holding law enforcement accountable for homeless issues.
Oh, okay, so thank you for coming, Doug. Appreciate
Sure.
what you've been doing, what you are doing. Is the VA involved at all? Because I know some of these people are veterans, and maybe they have some services or whatever they can get from the VA. Do you get any help from the VA?
Yes, we do. And actually, the VA is very, very responsive. So, and I'm glad you brought them up. One of the things I will say is that when you look at those that have a veteran status, getting them services is a top priority, not only for the federal government, but for everyone because of their service and their dedication. So money is made, or not money, well, money is made available, but resources are made available that if there is someone that is experiencing homelessness who has had prior service, that they can get into the programs. There's housing available. There's oftentimes vouchers that are designated. So it's not as much an issue for someone that has. It's just identifying them and making sure that they're willing to go in. Because some of them, through some of their stressors, they're distrustful. But I think right now we may be very close to functional zero for veteran homelessness.
So thank you so much for being here today. I'm somewhat familiar with some of the HUD programs. It strikes me that the HUD emphasizes housing, and sometimes those housing situation really leads to dependence, warehouse people, basically, instead of teaching self-responsibility. What I really appreciate, what I learned from you last time is the program that you initiated, the Union Rescue Mission, that helps teach self-responsibility. Mm-hmm. And you do some of this through mentoring and consultation. That's my question.
Yes, and so any of our program, what I would say is very heavily relies on mentoring and coaching and availability. We have guys that are very interested in, changing where they're at, but they don't know how. And so having someone that case manager or a mentor that comes in and just meets with them and encourages them, and that's really what I would say for most of us is a key driving factor. And so any organization that I believe is doing it right will have some mechanism by which mentors or volunteers can come in and be a part of that process. There's also just a fundamental community need for service, because what I would also advocate is that as they get out, these are men, women that want to return the favor to the community. I can't tell you, one of probably the coolest things that I ever saw was a gift that came through, and it was about $50, or no, I'm sorry, it's $500. A guy that came through a program that we had before I was there, helped him get a job. He got hired on by Honeywell. They relocated him to Kansas City, and he just dropped a note with a $500 check that said, "Thanks for all the support that you had." And he named mentors in the community. So it works for those that are interested. So, and it's very fundamental to any good program.
Thank you. My next question, you may have already partially answered this, but you alluded to there are problems with feeding, the problem with those people who do not want to change, not interested in anything except homelessness. what administratively would you do in our community to help divert that problem?
Well, number one, I don't think it's appropriate just to let anyone do whatever they want. I think we are a community that needs to be governed by rules. And so one of the challenges is, have they been offered services? One of the big challenges is we don't necessarily know who's been offered services and who hasn't. So in the community, there's a by name list. That by name list is voluntary for someone to put on so that providers can track who's been given what services. Maybe there's a case manager that Open Door has given to an individual that's very successful, and we can utilize that case manager while they're staying with us. So the by name list actually lets us know who's been given services and who hasn't, and that's an important part of the process. The other part of it is simply comes down to and this kind of comes back to the full circle of the vagrancy. At some point, if you choose to live without following the rules, there are consequences. And that's where I think the lines can get blurred of what's appropriate, what needs to happen, and how do we hold people accountable at the same time. And the courts have been very, very active in saying that if you, for instance, in the homeless arena, if you don't have beds that can service the needs, you can't arrest them for camping on the streets. Well, that's probably reasonable. But how many beds? Do we know how many? Where are we holding ourselves accountable to know what those numbers are? Because when you take an enforcement action, it should be the last resort. I'm not suggesting that it doesn't need to be done. I'm just saying if you don't want to pay millions of dollars after being sued, and that's what I'll tell you is the other thing is that I hope I've conveyed to you that those that are experiencing homelessness or even those that are having substance abuse or mental, that these are wise people. They know if their rights are being violated, and they are very successful, as they should be, in holding government accountable. So the challenge is when I talk at the very outset about setting policy, a good policy that's reasonable is going to hold up in court, and your community is not going to be spending millions of dollars in settlement payments or in judgments. And that's what happened in California and Texas and other areas. And Wichita was able to learn from those other municipalities. We just don't want to be that municipality. So when you hold someone accountable, you want to make sure that you've got a good backstop by which you hold them accountable, but you're also offering them a service.
Last question, Walt.
Good to see you, Doug. We've been together since 2000, right?
It's been a while.
It's been a while.
You hung in there with me.
I want to ask you to help us all understand where we start the process. You have a lot of your guys there in your facility that don't have a driver's license. And yet what started was they got a minor traffic ticket. They didn't have enough money to pay it. And then when they don't, they can't drive because their license is suspended, and they can't get to work, they lose their job, and they lose their house, they can't pay their rent. How many of the people in your facility at the rescue mission, what percentage were actually those that didn't have a driver's license and had been suspended by the state?
I would say easily, of those that were with us, 50%, if not more, probably had a suspended driver's license, and it's probably more, or never had it and it was generated and then suspended. So transportation is a huge issue, and what I would say for Wichita, Kansas is getting around without a car is very difficult. It's probably the number one challenge, our public transportation. So having a car, because of how sprawling we are to get to a job, say on the west side of town, we see people that are we'd see it in the police department, that would take that risk, would drive, hoping they don't get stopped. And it's a problem. And I applaud your work of holding the administrative fines at bay to get people legally licensed. The other challenge is that, and it really comes down to I guess I had a pleasant experience at the driver's license bureau the last time I went to get I lost my license and I went. So I'm going to say this and then turn around and go, well, the bureaucracy of getting the driver's license unsuspended or the fine looked at is really the challenge. And it gets very convoluted. We had a guy, David, who, when they found out that I had been in law enforcement, he came to me and was like, hey, I don't mean to bug you, but can you help me out? I got a notice from South Carolina or Georgia. He goes, I've never been to Georgia, that my license is suspended there. He goes, I can't get my Kansas driver's license because there's a suspension in Georgia, and I've never been to Georgia. And, it might be easy to go, okay, well, just pay the fine. But as we began to look into it, the problem was he was right. He'd never been there. And in fact, law enforcement, when they finally figured out, someone had used his name and created a false identity and racked up a bunch of fines. And because of that happening in Georgia, his only recourse was to hire an attorney to get that taken care of, which he couldn't afford. So he couldn't get a Kansas driver's license and so you start seeing some of this where you're like, there ought to be an easier way. Unfortunately, it's not. It was a year in that process of getting an attorney that we had to help advocate for him. We've got, challenges there of finding who can we trust that will go and do what they say they're going to do and not charge, maybe do it on a pro bono basis. But once he was able to get that taken care of, not through his issue, he was able to quickly get a Kansas driver's license. And I will tell you that, again, having a driver's license is a big deal when you haven't had one, especially to legally hold it and be able to drive. We had a guy named Kenneth, man. That guy was so excited because not only did he get his driver's license, but he got enough to buy a car. And the first thing he wanted to do is take everyone on car rides legally. And, you're proud of these guys for doing that. But I would just say, and this is a challenge for all of us, the thing that I may take for granted that I can, go get my driver's license when I lost it, I was able to get in and get it taken care of. But there's some challenges with that.
Okay, how about a nice round of applause for that?
Thank you very much. Appreciate it.
Merry Christmas, everybody.